Hi, I'm Bruce Doris, President and CEO of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the IIA Middle East Conference. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you about something that is so incredibly passionate to me, our global fraud studies, in particular during this pandemic. I want to thank everyone for attending this session and the opportunity to be a part of this. The ACFE has a tremendous presence in the Middle East. We've done a lot of work with the IIA in the Middle East, with our chapter, with the ACFE, with Al Nazaha there in the Middle East for the last year or so, providing a lot of training and outreach within the community. I wish I could be there in person with you, as we all do this time of this pandemic and the sea of change that we have had to go through. It's interesting that we're able to reach each other virtually and to talk to each other about so many different issues that we have within our various professional environments. And in particular with the ACFE, we have done a lot of work with the pandemic and how it has changed fraud risk management completely. If we start to look back at where we were a year ago now and where we have gone, it is incredible the seismic shift that we have had to make. And that's what I want to explore with you during this particular session. And so when you look at the title of this, Global Fraud Studies in a Pandemic and that need for fraud risk assessment, hopefully this is very helpful to you within the fraud component of what you do. We have so many resources at the ACFE and acfe.com for you to use and to look at and to help you with your particular jobs. One of the one that is an incredible resource for us and has been for over 25 years, going on 26 years now, is the ACFE Report to the Nation. Now, this came out in 2020. If you want to go to acfe.com/RTTN, I'll have the link at the end of this slide session as well, so that you can go and download that, go through it. It's, 80 or so pages of really good information that can help you, at least with the fraud component of what you do. When you look at the Report to the Nations, the Global Fraud Study, in its infancy, it started in 1996. At that time, it was just simply a 6-page survey that went to a number of members, because in the impetus behind this was we had reporters, we had a lot of different people asking us at the association, well, how much does fraud cost? How much is out there? And coming to us, I mean, at that particular time, we were not the research organization that we are now, with all of the reports, and we'll talk about other ones throughout this session as well. But people still were reaching out to us and wanting to know. People continue to reach out to us for not just the reports, but even props in movies. There was a movie with Dwayne Johnson, also known as The Rock, the wrestler, and Kevin Hart. It was made here in the United States, but Kevin Hart's character played a forensic accountant. And if you look at a scene within, it's about 20 or so minutes into the film, you'll see the 2-volume fraud examiner's manual. You will see all types of books, very similar to the ones behind me, showing what this character has done in terms of being ready for whatever engagement he has as relates to fraud. So the ACFE has grown, obviously, in the last 25, 26 years now. And this report has grown, just as what we do has grown and gone into so many different avenues. But we had access to that knowledge base. And just as the movies and cinema coming to us for information related to what you all do. I mean, we were that resource. And so they're coming to us asking that particular question. So we started thinking, well, let's put together this report. Let's ask our members, starting in 1996 and issuing that report. And at the time, I mean, everything was divided on cards. I mean, when that information came in, dividing it up, trying to put it into sections, and that report in its infancy, very small, and then grew to where it is now with, forget how I have to write down the information. You have 125 countries, 77 questions, versus just the few when we were just starting with this report. And it's been accessed and used by so many different news agencies. When I go to a conference and it's put on by someone other than the ACFE, when I see other speakers, a lot of times those who are talking and giving a session as it relates to fraud, many times they will use the data that we have in that report as part of their session. And so it's great to see the use of this information rather than just it being a static report that comes out every 2 years. So it's the goal of that is to identify those common characteristics, the risk profiles of fraudsters, so that we can get a better understanding as anti-fraud professionals and identify the risk better and faster so that we can reduce the number of frauds that take place and shorten the length of time to identify those and to hopefully recover those losses much, much faster. And if you look at the information as we go through here, you'll see that happens. But as we were introducing this report to the nations back in 2020, around April, this little thing called the coronavirus was really starting to impact everyone. And then this month represents a year of essentially a worldwide pandemic, and so much change, so much disruption overnight for many of us. This report that you see in front of you, the fraud in the wake of COVID-19, that benchmarking report, this is the most recent one. We'll probably issue another one next month, or at least start getting the data at the end of March and the beginning of April for this last quarter. But this is how it has impacted each and every one of you as practitioners. Regardless of what you had done before, COVID-19 impacted that and changed what you did. And so we wanted to see in real time what those changes were. And so this report started out of a lot of concern that you had as members and anti-fraud professionals, those of you working in this field, or at least part of your role as internal audit, needed this information to change and to identify a lot of the risks that were coming at that particular time. So when we started this, around 2,000 participants took place in it. And then, again, starting in late April of 2020, when we started to compile this information, released the first report in May of 2020. Number of questions that we were asking and trying to get information on. One is, how is COVID affecting the overall level of fraud within your organization or industry for that matter? What specific fraud risk are you seeing? What about your organization's anti-fraud programs, the budget and the resources geared toward it, and how is this impacting it? How is this impacting your ability to fight fraud? How are you able to negotiate what you have done before with so many changes and the inability to travel, the inability to access a lot of evidence to really go through and do your jobs effectively? And then what, how is that, what is that difficulty level? And how are these prominent challenges, or what are those prominent challenges? So we pull that information, put it into this report. And what I want to do before we get into the details of it is just pose this question to you hypothetically. As an anti-fraud professional, how has your job changed compared to a year ago? Has it become more challenging? Has it stayed the same? Has it become easier, or not really applicable to what you are doing? And so we put that question out to our participants in this role. I mean, a year ago was the last time that I was on an airplane flying anywhere. Interestingly enough, it was to Dubai for our ACFE Middle East Fraud Conference, which was in the latter part of February. And I could see the change going on then with what was happening in China, what was happening in parts of Europe, and how that was starting to get into other countries, what other countries were doing. I mean, I remember a football team that had traveled, and there was discussion of quarantining them within Dubai at that time. And again, this is just over a year ago now. And so if you think about, my goodness, it's been that long. But what we're going to focus on is, well, what about those changes within our job, with our professional duties? So if you look at that change, if you look at this particular figure, and if you want to go and download this complete report, I encourage you to do so. It is at acfe.com. I'll have the link again at the end. But if you look at this slide, what is that difficulty level of anti-fraud activities in terms of change? Has it become more challenging? And when you look at least the left side of that particular slide, you'll see where approximately 75% or so find it more challenging in our environment when it relates to preventing, detecting, and investigating fraud. And so we know that it's become more challenging. We know that even from the report to the nations, it's still challenging in recent years. Now, what's going to be interesting when we come out of this, we start looking at data about a year from now for the report to the nations, when you start looking at those changes, because the information that we look at for the 2020 report was up until the end of 2019. Well, the next report is going to be predominantly affected by the pandemic and the changes that we had to go through in order to live and to survive, and keeping our economies afloat despite everything that has been thrown at us related to the coronavirus. And so we will need to be mindful of how our audits, how our investigations took place, and knowing that that disruption is going to be demonstrated within a lot of that data. So I'm really curious as to how that change is going to be overall as it relates to the previous reports. Fortunately, we don't have to wait that long. We're able to see that within a lot of the figures that you're going to see over here in these next few minutes. So when the last information that we had, this last report, 79% of those who responded, again, over 2,000 respondents to this particular survey, have seen an increase in fraud since the pandemic began. And what's interesting about this statistic is you see that it's almost 80%. That keeps going up. If you go back to May, it was 68%. Go back to November, to August, it was mid 70s, about 76%. Now up to almost 80%. we are seeing fraud take place. Fraudsters are not stopping despite the coronavirus and what's going on. They have continued to operate. And one of the things that I have really stressed in writings, speeches, and as many outlets as I can find is that it now is not the time to cut anti-fraud resources within any organization. Fraudsters find that calamity. They will find that stress point, and they will find that ability to infiltrate our systems for a number of different ways. And we'll explore those as we go through. Now is not the time. And fortunately, a lot of groups, at least that we were able to get information from, demonstrate just that they are not backing down from that charge of making sure that each of you as internal audit, as fraud examiners, have the resources that we need to fight fraud and to get through this pandemic from what we're trying to do for our organizations. Now, looking at the overall scope of the report to the nations, the global fraud study that we started with, that came out approximately a year ago now, over 2,500 cases, again, 77 questions from over 125 countries. The total loss, over 3.5 billion US. Now, what's interesting about this, and these are just the big numbers from the report to the nations. What's interesting about this is that's just what we know about. That does not include what we don't know. And we have got to be mindful of that when we're presenting this information. I mean, these are just from 2,500 cases. And when we look at the estimate, and this number has been very consistent over the years, that CFEs estimate that organizations lose about 5% of revenue to fraud each year. But when you start thinking about that in terms, from internal audit, from those who are fraud examiners, and what that budget and those resources are that are allocated to you in order to fight fraud, how much more that would be if that's taken away. And it's much easier to use those monies in order to fight fraud, to prevent a lot of that from that bottom line, that profit margin, than it is to try to make it up from revenue later. I mean, it's something that we have to be very mindful of in terms of investing in what we do from internal audit as fraud examiners in order to keep our organizations afloat, especially in these times of pandemic. Now, looking back at the fraud in the wake of COVID-19 report, some very, very interesting data in terms of change in the overall level of fraud. I alluded to this a little earlier, but when you look at that overall level of change, about 68%, that scope has changed, had already seen an increase, and that continues to go up. And if you look at the very, very bottom there, the expectation, and as we mentioned, it continues to go up. You look at that bottom one, what's expected over the next 12 months, 90% indicate that there will be an increase of fraud within their organizations. We've seen it over the last year. I mean, Wirecard in Germany, huge financial losses. And when we start looking at a lot of other frauds from around the world, I mean, when it's Warren Buffett, investor, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And so now that credit begins to dry up, now that don't have access to the same pools that they did before within an organization in order to cover up those frauds, it is becoming more frauds will come to light. What's interesting and what I'm very interested in seeing in the next several months as earnings come due for those who have been in this cycle for a complete year. So that we're now moving into March and April of 2021. We've got a year of the pandemic under our belt, so to speak. How will financial statement fraud rise as it relates to accounting estimates that had previously been done? Delays in reporting, other changes that were made because we couldn't do the proper testing, and there was a delay in that. That additional time to file. So these are all things that I'm interested to see how that impacts bottom line of organizations around the world. And we'll start to see that probably within the next few months, if not coming weeks. Now, when you look at the fraud tree as it relates to the report to the nations, this is something that's in the Fraud Examiner's Manual, very detailed. As we all know, the ACFE focusing on occupational fraud and abuse with these three main categories of corruption, asset misappropriation, and financial statement fraud. And what has always been the same, whether a pandemic or not, we've seen an inverse relationship here. So with corruption, and these are in US dollars, so 43% of the cases reported. And there's going to be some overlap between the three of these, depending on the case. So it's greater than 100%. So when you look at this, at 43% of the cases, had a median loss of $200,000. And these are bribery and corruption issues, conflicts of interest, things like that, kickbacks from vendors. Financial statement fraud represented, at least in terms of the respondents, about 10% of the cases, but had a median loss of nearly $1 million US. And then when you look at those related to asset misappropriation, you had 86% of the cases with a median loss as it pertained to asset misappropriation of $100,000 US. So you have a vast majority of cases that fall under that category. And then you have just a small amount of financial statement fraud. But we have so many resources that we dedicate toward that bottom section of it. And what we've got to do is to make sure that within that pandemic, there's a lot of things that we're unable to do physically within our office. We need to make sure that we've got the proper resources that are allocated toward the right safeguards as to protect against financial statement fraud and to protect against corruption. As we reassess risk, as we go through that fraud risk assessment that we should be doing, and hopefully that each and every one of you have done so far within your organizations. With limited resources, how do we reallocate that? I remember having a conversation with a fraud examiner who had just recently told me, this is some time ago, some travel and entertainment expenses that they had, some wrongdoing that they had found within their organization. But you're talking about a few, maybe $10,000 or so in terms of what they had found. But what was interesting is it's a few months later, I saw that same company had a pretty massive financial statement fraud into the millions in US. And it started to make me think about what were the allocation of resources that were given to that particular team. And we've got to make sure that we're getting the biggest bang for our investment, especially within the pandemic, and making sure that we've got those resources allocated the correct way. Part of that reason, we see an increase in cyber fraud. So making sure that you've got the resources in place, that even if it's using contractors to come in to help in terms of combating cyber fraud within your organization. You can see that uptick there with, from May in 2020 all the way up to where it is now. And of course, expected to see an 88% of you expect to see an increase over the next 12 months, especially in talks that I've had with members, in particular with the FBI here in the United States. One of the biggest areas with personal identifying information, PII, has really been an uptick in what they've seen and what a lot of practitioners have seen as it relates to cyber fraud. The difficulty to travel, the difficulty to communicate, difficulty to make sure that those who are out there have the resources and are using them correctly. If you go back in time to, I think it was 2017 when Maersk had the NotPetya attack, and some of the stories and that I had heard coming out of Denmark, going around and pulling machines and pulling cord from to stop that attack or to keep it from proliferating within the organization. I mean, it was stopping Maersk around the world, but they were doing everything they can there. Pull that into today. I mean, we can't do that because a lot of your IT staff is working at their home, in their apartment, or in their house. And so that's one safeguard that is there that we had placed before COVID. That's not really helpful. Hopefully, as we move out of the pandemic, we can get back to a more sense of normality there, but we're not there yet. And even outside of fraud, our systems are vulnerable to intrusion because many of you are on a VPN right now. And so you're watching and you're secure. But when you were here, or rather at your particular office, you had safeguards in place. You knew when to Control Alt Delete, when to log out if you walked away. If you're at your table in your kitchen or somewhere in your home, do you always log out? Maybe not. I mean, it may be secure. But what the risk, and perhaps not a fraud risk, but still a risk nonetheless, is a 2 or 3 year old toddler now being able to walk up and do something to your keyboard as you had walked away to get a beverage or something from your kitchen. And so, not that that would happen to any of you, but the risk is there. And these are things that before COVID that we didn't think about. And so we're having to think outside the box. We're having to make sure that we address a tremendous amount of new risk. But the cyber fraud is something that is very telling, that we're really having to deal with on a very, very increased frequency. Fraudsters haven't stopped. They're still in the basements of homes. They're still they weren't out to begin with or outside to begin with anyway. When we start looking at a lot of these cyber attacks, and they're more coordinated and how they are affecting us, we need to be prepared to handle that. Employee embezzlement, seen increase since we started getting this data in May of 2020. You can see that increase there. A lot of lack of reconciliation and being able to do the things and perform the controls that we previously did. And then bribery and corruption that I had mentioned a little bit earlier. So you see that increase there. We're seeing that our CFEs expect more and more in this particular area as well. I'm going to be very interested to see as we continue to do this study until we're out of this pandemic, of how that number changes because of the ability for supply chains to get back to a sense of normality. And does that go higher? Does that trend higher? We'll see. But it just makes me to really stress is whether or not we've updated our fraud risk assessment. So if you look at this question and look at it from rhetorically, has your organization updated its fraud risk assessment in the last year? So absolutely, or it's usual. We definitely did in light of COVID-19, or that we haven't, or hopefully we're not in near those bottom categories that we don't conduct formal fraud risk assessments. And so one of the things that we're really wanting to focus on, that I want to focus on, is to make sure that we as fraud examiners, that we as internal audit, that is at the forefront. If we haven't done it so far, we do so. But the thing about a fraud risk assessment is that it is a living, breathing thing. It is not a do it once and put it away. It is continuous. And we have to continually do this because we see the change. The data supports that change. So that's why I want you to use that. Talk to your boards, talk to management about why you need to continue to have the anti-fraud resources and dedicate those toward a fraud risk assessment and the continuation of it. This slide tells you a lot, because if you can look and see the top 4 concealment methods by fraudsters, if you look at the bottom of the quadrant, you'll see that this again is from the 2020 report to the nations. 40% created fraudulent physical documents, 30%, 36% altered physical documents, 27% were electronic documents, and then 26% created fraudulent electronic documents. So when you look at those again, there's going to be bleed over between the various components here. So it's not exactly 100% across the board. But what's interesting is how when we do this again, and you don't want to wait for this, we want to take care of this now. But when this report comes out again about a year from now, the left side and the right side will switch. Why? Because if you look at 2020, which would be the first year of that report, when we released this in 2022, you only had about 2 months, maybe 3 months that you were able to physically go to your office. When we start thinking about that disruption and the creation of those, that is going to decrease. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plans out. But we have got to be mindful of that and make sure that we've dedicated our resources and where we need to be looking for fraudulent behavior within our organizations. You know, we know that a lot of organizations had to really tighten down, at least initially, on budgets and some of those controls. But we need to make sure that we're compensating for that, and we're trying to get the biggest bang for our investment, as we could see from a couple of slides ago. Now, when you go back and look at the report, the initial report to the nations, and how that's going to be impacted by that previous slide. So how does the detection method relate to fraud, duration, and loss? You don't want to be in that top category. We don't want to find out by accident. We don't want law enforcement coming to us and telling us that fraudulent activity took place within our offices. We want to be in those very active or proactive controls, and there are many more as well. You're very familiar with those within internal audit. We want to make sure that we are proactive in going after looking for fraud, because when you look at the time frame of how long it takes for a fraud to be uncovered and how that has been reduced over the years, and it's very encouraging to me to see how we have reduced from 18 months to 16 to 14 months for a lot of frauds. Of those 2,500 cases that were used as part of this study. That's encouraging because it means that companies are listening. They're listening to you as internal audit. They know where these pain points are because you've identified them. You've demonstrated where the controls are and what that change is. So when we look at if we do have these in place and whether we don't, it's much, much larger. We have a slide that you can demonstrate to your management or to your board about that as well. But when fraud is detected proactively, it's detected faster, it causes lower losses. That has been illustrated in this report for so many years. So the question comes, what's that most important one? Which one that we want to focus on if we have very little resources to dedicate? How has the number of tips coming in at your organizations changed during this pandemic? Has it increased? Has it remained the same? Has it decreased over the years? Now, hotlines have been and consistently been the most important anti-fraud control to use to get our staff reporting fraud within our organizations. It's, to me, it's quite simple, especially when you start looking at the data. When you start looking at the trend up here, the median losses were nearly doubled at an organization that did not have a hotline. You'll see that about 64%, which means about a third didn't have a hotline within their organizations, which still, after 20 years of doing this and 25 years of doing this and showing how important hotlines are, that there's organizations that still don't have one in place. But the data shows that organizations with hotlines detect frauds more quickly than those without. And so if you look at the time period, that 18 months to 12 months, that can be a considerable amount of money when we start getting into those higher amounts that we saw from the fraud tree earlier, when we start looking at financial statement fraud, asset misappropriation, bribery and corruption. We start looking at all of those together with the data that we have. We know that having that hotline in place is something that is critical to uncovering fraud faster and reducing that loss. But here's the thing, we can go a step further. It's a lot of data here, but what I want you to do with this data is to be able to use it. Your takeaway is to use this information to bolster your anti-fraud controls within your organization. So you can see up here, training increases the likelihood of detection by tip. So it's good to have a hotline, but it's better if we have a hotline that is active because we have told our employees about it. We have trained them. We have made them mini CFEs. We have given them information that has really helped to explain the importance of what a hotline is, how we have a tremendous anti-fraud stance within our organization. We've got an incredible tone at the top. And by demonstrating that to our staff, we then will show that, that data becomes even more relevant. Of 48% of cases detected by tip with training, which is much less without it. You go to the right side of the screen, tips are more likely to be submitted through reporting mechanisms with training. Absolutely. When we start looking at this, it's very, very telling that if we're able to be active about this, and we've had to use these Zoom, we've had to use different ways to communicate with our staff. We have got to make sure that we continue that. One of the things of just having employee education is vital. We have International Fraud Awareness Week, which many of you may be familiar with and perhaps participated. We had a record number of sponsors back in November of 2020. We used that week to talk about our hotlines, talk about our tone at the top. So many of you that are attending here and speaking, I saw some speakers that are part of the IA Middle East Conference that are corporate alliance members at the ACFE. I know what their tone at the top is. It's incredible. And they're able to use that to talk about what their stance is as an organization as it relates to fraud. So that is what we've got to do. We have got to make sure that we have our Zoom meetings to talk about this. It doesn't have to be all day long, but just using that to illustrate how we can talk about what types of tips are relevant, and using that training to educate our staff so that they have that aha moment. Like, oh wait, I did see something like that. I need to report it. But if they don't know about it, if we haven't communicated that, and even in a pandemic, it's even more important in a pandemic because we can't walk from office to office anymore. We can't have company meetings and bringing them into boardrooms. We have to communicate with them electronically. And so we've got to make sure that we continue to do that. Putting out articles, sending emails, having some white paper, but having it adopted from the top is what's most important. So the use of anti-fraud controls, targeted ones, has increased over the last decade. And this is something I want to focus on because I mentioned, the data has shown this. And I've been at the ACFE for nearly 15 years now, and it's something that I talk about with every opportunity that I can. If we can just focus on these, there are a lot of them out there. Continuous monitoring, from an internal audit standpoint, very, very, data analytics. These are all important. Please don't get me wrong there. But if we can just focus on these, we make such a big impression within our organizations. So looking at what has been adopted, that hotline, it's up 13% over the last 10 years that we've been doing this study. Anti-fraud policies being adopted, increasing by 13% over the last 10 years. Fraud training up 11%. Fraud training for managers and executives up as well. This is great news. Obviously, we want to see it completely across the board, but it's good, it's encouraging to see those trend up. Because as I mentioned before, and this is the big takeaway, the presence of those controls, it's lower fraud losses, it's quicker detection when you start pulling those together. The lack of internal controls, and this group is someone I don't have to tell this to, this, contributed to nearly 1/3 of the frauds that were part of this study of over 2,500 cases by certified fraud examiners from around the world. If you want particular data as it relates to the Middle East and North Africa, that information is out there as well. If you go to acfe.com, there are a lot of sub-reports as well with it, not just regional, but by industry as well. So go and look at those at acfe.com. 90% of the respondents expected increase of fraud over the next 12 months. The thing is, if we're expecting this, are you getting the funding that you need? And that's an important question. How's the budget changed over the last year? Has it increased? Is it about the same? Has it decreased? Very fortunate, as I mentioned earlier in this session, that when you start looking at the overall budget for an anti-fraud program, about 85% of you, that's not bad. There's either been no change or a slight increase or a significant increase. So the vast majority, it hasn't changed or it's gotten a little bit better overall. That's good to hear. The same thing when it relates to staffing and a lot of, fortunately, the technology that you need to do your jobs effectively, that your IT staff needs to do their jobs effectively. The only one that we saw the negative one, at least considerably, was for travel, which is to be expected in the pandemic. You don't have the places to go. You don't have that part of what we've done before. But I want to see that budget for anti-fraud training and professional development increase, because if we're not able to talk about it, even if we're just talking about it internally during Fraud Awareness Week, that is something that we need to make sure that we've got across the board throughout our organization. So some of the most prominent challenges, as we can be expected, those first three are really problematic. The inability to travel, which affects the ability to conduct interviews and affects that inability to access evidence. And of course, this is going to depend on the industry that you're in, where you are, what your supply chains are. But it is interesting that we see the pain points with what this pandemic has brought. It's obviously brought a lot to us personally, and stressing so many of you have dealt with this, with COVID-19, perhaps yourself, family members, and so much has impacted us personally. It's impacted us professionally as well, as you all know, and this data demonstrates that. So when we start looking at those particular challenges, what are some of the takeaways that we've got with our looking at this data and how we can take this back to our organizations? Well, obviously, the first one is updating that fraud risk assessment if we haven't already. Revisiting your hotline and fraud awareness training. The one thing that we have got to be aware of is, especially with that fraud risk assessment, is in the previous slide demonstrated this. We can't do the interviews the way we did before. Having that access of walking down a hall and looking something up that we had. So we've got to make sure that we address that within our fraud risk program and overall fraud risk management of our organization. If one thing that I have seen, especially as it relates to the third bullet point, that's continue to educate at all levels, is we have brought a lot of people together during this pandemic. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, even within the ACFE, when I'm meeting with the directors that are here, we're meeting probably more often via Teams than we did when we were physically here. I mean, it was easy. I mean, we communicated, of course, and we were able to go over to this office and that office. But now we are dedicated at the same time, the same week, so that we can all go through and talk about the various issues that each of us had. I mean, that's not from an anti-fraud perspective. That's just, overall. And so we're dedicating more time to having that collaboration. And so if we're able to do that within our fraud risk assessment program, so if IT is more involved now, because they have to be with us, with internal audit, with those in accounting, with risk, bringing those together, we can see what those problem areas are. If we haven't had that yet, use this information from these slides in order to figure out what that is. And so that's what I want to have this hopefully this data helps you navigate the challenges that are before you. We need that training. We need that collaboration in talking about fraud as it relates to COVID-19 and the changes that we are seeing. So go to the website, download that. Here are the links that I've mentioned in the report to the nations, which at acfe.com/RTTN, and then fraud in the wake of COVID-19 at that report. And there'll be another one that comes out in the matter of the next month or so as well, updating that information. And then if you look at acfe.com, there's also a coronavirus resource page that has a lot of other helpful tips if it's something that you need to help you with your organization. And then in just a few weeks, we've got our ACFE Middle East Conference completely dedicated to anti-fraud training and education. And so depending on your scope within internal audit, if this is something that interests you, would enjoy having you as part of that event in a few weeks on 7 and 8 of April, coming up very, very soon. Wish we could be there in person, as I mentioned earlier. The last plane trip I took was to Dubai about a year ago, and I miss it. I miss being out. I miss talking to everyone, to seeing and having those really good, frank discussions about the anti-fraud profession, what you're doing to combat fraud, and what we can do at the ACFE to help that and shine that spotlight on you and all the good work that you do. I hope that you have a great rest of your conference this week, and it's been a pleasure to spend this last 50 minutes with you. Bye-bye.